Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the White Nationalism webinar. My name's Jay. I'm a member of CRCAA. I have brown hair. I'm non-binary and I'm white. And we want to know who you are. So chat what city you're from, what pronouns you use, what org you're a part of, and who you're in solidarity with. And make sure when you're chatting that you're chatting to all panelists and participants so we can all see your wonderful answers. So drop in the chat for folks who are coming in, what city you're from, what pronouns you use, what org you're a part of, or who you're in solidarity with. And if you have questions throughout this webinar, use the Q&A button and we will address the questions that we can at the end. If you're watching the live stream, add your questions and comments. And I see Oakland representing. And where else, where are other people from? We got 44 people here. I want to know where y'all are from. I see Oakland repping Sunrise Bay Area, Oakland repping Surge, San Diego, Peoria, Oakland, Newport Beach, New Orleans, Oakland, San Diego, and keep dropping them in the chat and tell us what organization you're with or who you're in solidarity with. I see Boston, another San Diego. Welcome from San Diego, y'all. San Francisco. And for folks who are just coming in, drop in the chat what pronouns you use, where you're from, what city you're watching from, what org you're a part of, and who you're in solidarity with. Oakland, all the way from Vancouver, Detroit, San Francisco, Burlingame, California. Wow. From all over, all coming together to learn about white nationalism and how we can defeat it and how we are defeating it. Seattle, the North Bay, and make sure that when you're putting it in the chat, you're messaging all panelists and attendees. Thanks, Kelsey, for lifting that up. And for folks who are just coming in, drop in the chat what city you're watching from, what pronouns you use, what org you're a part of, who you're in solidarity with. And make sure in the chat you message to all participants, all attendees and panelists, so we can all see where we're zooming in from. And as we continue, feel free to drop comments in the chat. And if you have any questions, use the Q&A button. We have time after our Zoom presentation to go through some questions. And it's 5:05, so let's get started, and feel free to keep jumping in the chat where you're zooming in from. So can I get the next slide, please? So who are we? CRCAA, Community Ready Corps Allies and Accomplices, is a committee called sorry, I'm a little nervous, y'all. CRCA is a committee called by CRC to organize white people to practice the 5 methods to dismantle white supremacy and support Black self-determination. So why is dismantling white supremacy is important? And why do white people have a strategic role to play in that fight? We want to ask in the chat, why do you think white people have a strategic role to play in the fight to dismantling white supremacy? Wow, coming in hot. We put it in place. We need to tear it down because we can weaponize our privilege for the fight. We created it. We have to dismantle it. Opportunities to weaponize white privilege. There's some 5 methods work showing up. White people have power to leverage to dismantle white supremacy, and white supremacy is a white people problem. Yes, it's our problem. I'm seeing a lot of that in the chat. And we have found a great deal of political clarity as white anti-racists by studying the white nationalist movement. And we hope that you will leave this webinar with some of that clarity. Next slide, please. So I want to review the 5 methods. And on this slide, it says 5 methods of weaponization of white privilege and divestment of white power. The 5 methods, sorry, I got a upset dog in the background apparently. The 5 methods are education, organization, contribution, not control, intervention, and divestment. And we are gonna go full in on all of the 5 methods during this webinar. So this is just our first slide on it, and we'll go in more depth. And if you're in the 5 methods bootcamp right now, put a smiley face or a shout out in the chat. These folks have been studying the 5 methods in depth for the last 8 weeks. Fuck yes to that. We got some smiley faces. Ooh, they're coming in. Make sure you do to all panelists and all attendees so we can all see and give you guys some major props for going through this bootcamp with us. And so the goal of this workshop is to inspire and equip more white people to practice the 5 methods wherever they are. And we are gonna talk about the 5 methods in depth. Next slide, please. So this is an image of CRC members distributing masks, coronavirus kits in Deep East Oakland, which they've been doing since March. CRCAA would not exist without being called forward by CRC, and we want to give them a major shout out. CRC's work for Black self-determination is fighting white nationalism. CRC's work is for safety, survival, and self-determination. This has included supporting the Black community through COVID, like we see in this image, patrolling Lake Merritt when nooses were hung, supporting the Moms for Housing work, and so much more. We would not be here today without CRC, and their framework is beyond. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Margaret.
Great. Next slide, please. Yes, thanks. So we're gonna start off with CRC's definition of white nationalism. They define white nationalism as a power system based on the concept of white supremacy. It's the codification of white supremacy into policies and procedures with the ultimate objective of unchallenged white hegemonic power. So hegemonic means dominant and ruling. And what we want to make clear, what CRC's definition makes clear, that this is scientific. It's not an accident. It's not some unconscious bias. This is purposeful. So today's presentation is really about looking at the sort of like the frame of the puzzle, right? We're looking at the movement of white nationalism as a whole. We're centering the anti-Blackness of it all, but we're really only going to be framing it out. We're not going to be filling in the whole picture for you. There's not enough time in 2 hours to do that, and there's a lot that we can even just get at in the frame. The other thing to remember is that there's going to be a lot of information. Even though we're only framing it out, there's a ton of information, and that's probably not going to sink in the first time around. So please consider this webinar as a resource to refer back to anytime you need to or want to. It will be available on CRCAA's Facebook page. We also have a couple of our past white nationalism and intervention webinars up there, and those 2 webinars have a lot of additional content that isn't in this presentation. Next slide, please. So we want to give you a content warning. The alt-right is gross. White nationalism is super gross, repugnant. We're going to be talking about really ugly, violent things. But we've got to use brutal terms for brutal realities. That is a direct quote from Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. I'm going to say it again. We've got to use brutal terms for brutal realities. These realities are brutal, and we need to really understand them and not be liberal about them, not talk around them, but talk really directly about them. If we're not talking directly, if we're not understanding these brutal realities, that's not going to serve our end of undermining white nationalism. Next slide, please. So this image here is a depiction of a slave ship, a picture of white men bringing Africans to the US in chains. When we talk about white nationalism, we're talking about the foundation of this country, not a fringe movement. So this image, on the bottom of this image, it says America was founded on white supremacy. Even though this country has changed a great deal since its founding, the state still organizes its power through white supremacy. And we're going to return to this point a few times during this. White supremacy's only ideological center is white dominance and power. It can shapeshift and take any form it needs to take in order to maintain dominance and power. The status quo is white supremacist. There's different styles of white supremacy that compete with each other. There's conservative white supremacists, there's neoliberal white supremacists, there's the alt-right. And this is why we practice the 5 methods, right? So that we are educating ourselves, we're organizing, we're intervening, we are divesting, and we're contributing and not controlling. I'm going to pass this off now to Kelsey.
Thanks, Margaret. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white cisgender woman with blonde hair, wearing a black top. And we are looking at a slide that depicts a picture of the White House and some of the cis white men who were at the Charlottesville March. And it says primary and secondary predators on the screen. So Community Ready Corps has developed a framework for examining how the ideology of white supremacy is perpetuated through white nationalism by using the lens of primary and secondary predators. Much of the language that I'll be using in describing this framework today has been described to us by CRC leadership, and it is their philosophy and their strategy that we're striving to present today. So under white nationalism, the primary predator is the white power system and its key individuals and institutions with closest proximity to this power, who create structures to maintain this power. Examples of primary predators include the state, such as Donald Trump and different governing bodies, law enforcement, major political parties, big banks, corporate media, jails, prisons, etc. Not all individuals who make up these structures and institutions are primary predators themselves, and they may even contest the white power system from within. However, these structures, the institutions, and individuals like Donald Trump continue to maintain the white nationalist agenda of upholding white power and perpetuating the ideology of white supremacy as they currently operate. Secondary predators are actors with much less proximity to dominance in the white power system, who are outsourced by primary predators to both perpetuate the violence and control enacted by primary predators, as well as deflect attention away from those who are at the top. Examples of secondary predators include alt-right supporters, self-identified white supremacists, quote-unquote grassroots white nationalists, and vigilantes. It also includes people, sometimes disenfranchised themselves, who have been convinced by primary predators that they should compete with, enact violence toward, and attempt to control the most disenfranchised communities in this country. An example of that would be poor or working class white folks being told and believing that immigrants are stealing their jobs and engaging in violent behavior or grouping up with white nationalist groups as a result. So secondary predators do the dirty work of the primary predators, and they take on the visibility of the violence enacted by primary predators. If we only address the secondary, then the primary predatory system will continue to create more. So we need to challenge the primary, yet we also need to challenge the secondary because they're intertwined. So this webinar is focused on better understanding secondary predators so we can learn best how to engage them, either organize them into anti-racist struggle or organize against them in order to effectively challenge and ultimately take down the primary predators. Because secondary predators get activated when the primary predatory system is being threatened. And we're seeing more visibility of white nationalists everywhere. I mean, those Boogaloo boys have ruined Hawaiian shirts for all of us. Not saying I wanted to wear one. But their increasing visibility is also a sign that what we're doing is working. And we need to continue to organize ourselves and our community to keep pushing back. So before we can look ahead, let's take a look back to see and learn how secondary predators have operated throughout post-Civil War United States history and the ongoing anti-racist struggle that has continued to push back on them and move all of us closer to liberation. So passing it off to Katie.
Right on. Thanks so much, Kelsey. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with short blonde hair and I'm wearing glasses. This is an image of a political cartoon from the era that I'm about to take us back to, which is the Reconstruction era from 1863 to 1877, which was also the first wave of the Klan. And this image depicts the KKK and the White League working together to oppress a Black family, and the caption says, quote, "worse than slavery." So, like Kelsey was just saying, something that's really important and that CRC Community Ready Corps really emphasized to us in preparing for this webinar is that this is really about us through CRC's genius that they've passed on to us to teach to white folks. We're here to really demystify this movement of white nationalism and these secondary predators. CRC teaches us, if any of y'all have ever been to any of their security trainings, they teach about demystifying violence and looking at a human body, about all the places that an attack could come from, right? Because when we're scared of something, we make it out to be this thing that we can't possibly actually defend ourselves against or even defeat. And so that is really the opposite of what we want to do here. We don't want to leave feeling defeated. We want to leave feeling activated and clear about how to really defeat, and that throughout history, the white nationalist movement has been defeated over and over and over again. Another really important theme here, and to be clear about, is that the secondary predator class of the white nationalist movement gets really animated and activated when white supremacy is being defeated and weakened. It's been gasping for its last breath since Reconstruction, which is why we're going back to this time period. And we're just gonna zoom through some of this history. We encourage y'all to do your own studying. Another really, really, really important point to take away here is that white nationalists, the movement has been dying, right? Like we were just saying, it's been gasping for its last breaths, and it's been defeated over and over again. And it rears its ugly head whenever Black folks win some degree of power towards self-determination. Every single time Black people gain power and more self-determination, there's this backlash from the white nationalist movement. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's always been that case. So to actually go into the first wave of the Klan, right, during the Reconstruction era, the influences to the creation of the Klan at this time, right, as backlash to Black folks winning some degree of power towards self-determination. The influences were the Confederacy losing the Civil War, the abolition of chattel slavery, and the Reconstruction era effort by the federal government to politically enfranchise Black people. The goals of the KKK, this first wave, were to terrorize and punish recently freed Black people and push Black people out of the political arena. And some of the tactics they engaged in were armed guerrilla warfare. The KKK killed thousands of Black Southerners during this period, particularly targeting Black people who dared to vote. They drove Black farmers off their land, and they bombed homes of large Black families. A statistic we want to share with y'all is that 35 out of 265, or 13%, of Black politicians elected to office during this time were murdered by the Klan and other white supremacist groups, 13%. There was opposition, as there always has been, to the white nationalist movement. And the opposition at that time were that Black people organized armed patrols to protect their communities. And the downfall of the Klan during this time period was repression from the federal government. In addition to the opposition, was repression from the federal government via the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. And a federal grand jury declared the Klan a, quote, terrorist organization and issued hundreds of indictments. So that's the first wave of the Klan. Next slide, please, for the second wave of the Klan. All right. We're looking at an image of a eugenics pamphlet from this era, which was 1915 to 1940, right? So we're talking 100 to less than 100 years ago. And this pamphlet claims that, quote, unfitness can be, quote, bred out in 3 generations through use of eugenics. So this second wave of the Klan, this was the most mainstream the Klan ever got. The influences at this time were the eugenics movement. Something to be very clear about is the Nazis got many of their ideas about eugenics, also known as the scientific study of how to, quote, improve a race of people. The Nazis got many of their ideas about eugenics from middle and upper class white people in the United States. Eugenics started as a social movement and became incorporated into the dominant systems, particularly the medical system and how we tend to think about health, right? Think about how the COVID pandemic is being handled by the government today, right? Other influences during this time period for the second wave of the Klan were that Birth of a Nation, that film, glamorized the original Klan. The white robes and hoods were actually an invention of the movie and not part of the original Klan. And the second wave of the Klan adopted the costume from the movie, right? So the importance of media. And during this time, from 1915 to 1940, there was a wave of immigration of European Jews and Catholics, which the Klan considered a new, quote, invading population. Next slide, please. So this is a photo of a huge Klan rally held in the 1920s. And now I'm going to talk about some of the tactics of the Klan during this time, this second wave. They had full-time paid recruiters charging initiation fees and selling their costume, and which led to the largest Klan upsurge with 2 to 6 million Klan members, or about 15% of the eligible population at the time. And the eligible population were white Protestant men. So 15% of the eligible population was in the Klan. They also engaged in cultural organizing. They had a baseball team. They had 150 newspapers, and they had 2 radio stations. So again, media. They engaged in electoral organizing to win governing power. 16 senators, 11 state governors, 60 members of Congress, 60 members of Congress, all openly ran as Klansmen during this time. They also organized around moral issues like adultery, divorce, and drunkenness. Remember, this is the Prohibition era, right? The 20s. Also during this time period, we really want to lift up and raise attention to this organization that probably none of you have ever heard of before, called the Black Legion, which engaged in union busting, doing capitalist dirty work. And they rose as the Klan was declining during this time period. The Klan during this period, the second wave, really had their heyday during the 20s, and then they started declining in the 30s. And the Klan had been serving the function of keeping Black workers afraid. As it declined after the 20s, white supremacists needed another way to terrorize these workers. And so the DuPont family and General Motors funded the Black Legion, which was a terrorist group that started to stop unionization in auto factories in the 1930s. The Black Legion threw bombs into union halls, set fire to labor activists' homes, tortured union organizers, and killed at least 50 in Detroit alone, primarily targeting Black migrants who came to the Midwest for the auto factory jobs. And at its peak, the Black Legion had over 135,000 members, including numerous public officials and police chiefs. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kelsey to talk about the burning of Black Wall Street.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so the Tulsa Race Massacre, otherwise known as the burning of Black Wall Street, happened during the second wave of the Klan in Memorial Day weekend, 1921. We're looking at a slide that has a picture of a Black man with his back to the camera, and he's standing and kind of looking at the rubble that was once considered Black Wall Street. So this is at the time that the Klan is in its second, most mainstream and arguably most violent wave. And at the same time, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma was the wealthiest Black community in the country. It was also the closest thing to a self-determined Black community that the country had ever seen. So this massacre began with the accusation of a young 19-year-old Black man having assaulted a young white woman. He was arrested and taken into custody. An angry white mob showed up to, as per the rumors that were spreading, lynch this man. And a group of 75 Black men showed up to protect him when he was released from jail. And some of them were armed. As they were kind of escorting him away from the jail, a white man, went up, attempted to disarm one of these Black men. A shot was fired, and then a firefight ensued. It resulted in the deaths of 2 Black men and 10 white men. And once this news spread, angry white mobs just rampaged the district. They were looting and burning businesses, looting and burning homes. And it took place over an entire weekend. At one point, even a privately owned aircraft dropped firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing families. 150 people were murdered. Over 800 were admitted to hospitals for their injuries. And over 6,000 Black residents were interned in makeshift detention centers for several days. In the aftermath of this massacre, 10,000 Black residents were left homeless. The property damage amounted to the equivalent of $32 million today. And the Black community's property was never restored, nor were they compensated in any way for this damage. And at the time, this was the largest destruction of Black wealth that had ever occurred until the foreclosure crisis of 2008. So this is a really heavy story. And in Katie having described the earlier waves of the Klan, this massacre speaks to the white resentment toward the Black community for accruing wealth and cultivating self-determination. The violent backlash of white people toward the struggle and gains of the Black community is like clockwork. And it's also a telltale sign that the Black community is starting to win in the struggle. And we're going to keep paying attention to this pattern as we go through the history. I will pass it back to Katie.
Thanks, Kelsey. All right, so we're still in the second wave of the Klan. Kelsey just shared with us about the burning of Black Wall Street, which was in 1921. So also during the second wave of the Klan, women joined the Klan, right? We often think of white nationalists, we think of white men, and that's very real, but also us white women are just as culpable for perpetuating white supremacy, and we have to recognize that. This is an image that we're looking at of women in the KKK holding a march, carrying a sign saying "America first, one God, one country, one flag" with crosses on it. So the women of the KKK Auxiliary Division had 1 million members. The strongest chapters were in places you might not expect: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Arkansas. So, you know, not just the South, as folks stereotypically think of, but the East Coast, Midwest, New England area. White Protestant women were drawn to the Klan in hopes of winning the right to vote. Important, right? Activities included organizing boycotts of anti-Klan businesses and working to reform public schools, promoting, quote, biblical education, sound familiar, and attacking Catholic and Jewish educators. So opposition to the Klan at this time, to all of the Klan, not just the women, but the entire KKK, were that civic groups organized to expose the Klan's secrecy. When one group threatened to publish a list of all Klan members in Indiana, Klan membership rapidly declined. Right? Remember that there's always been opposition to this bullshit. And the ultimate downfall of the KKK during this second wave were a number of factors. One was economic depression. This is during the Great Depression era. There were financial scandals and internal divisions inside the KKK. There was external opposition, like we talked about, and criminal behavior by Klan leaders. One Klan leader kidnapped, raped, and murdered a white woman who refused to go on a date with him, after which tens of thousands of Klan members quit en masse. So really it's important, right, as we're looking at demystifying these folks, like they have weak points, and the Klan during the second wave really took themselves down. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to get into the third wave of the Klan, which is taking us up to the probably the wave that we're all most familiar with from the 1950s to 60s. This is an image of a protest to integrate a movie theater in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1960s. So the goals of the Klan during this time, this third wave, it was another wave of white supremacist backlash, right? They were opposing the civil rights movement, especially the voting rights and integration of residential neighborhoods, right? So Black folks gain some self-determination and power, and white nationalists have to strike back. Tactics of the Klan at this time is that they had a decentralized organizational structure. There were independent KKK groups starting to pop up all over the South. They murdered dozens of Black and white civil rights activists, and they bombed the homes of Black families who moved into white neighborhoods. Between 1951 and 1952, so just in a year's period, at least 40 homes were bombed by the Klan in the South. And at this time, the Klan also infiltrated law enforcement and the military, right? So cops and Klan go hand in hand, right? Opposition at the time, as we very well know, was the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And the downfall of the Klan was that opposition, was that the civil rights and the Black Power movements were more powerful and more popular. And that's really, really important to remember and to know. And with that, I'll pass it over to Margaret.
So I had forgotten to describe myself before. So I am a white cis woman with red hair and wearing a black and gray top. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about the period between, at least in this slide, I'm going to be talking about the period between 1974 to the 1980s. I asked to do this time because this is the time that I grew up in. So we're talking, the image that we're looking at right here, there's on the left hand, there's a poster of Reagan who's running for president, and you'll see the slogan that he was using may look really familiar to us all: "Let's make America great again." And then on the right-hand side, there's a picture of a newspaper, the White American Resistance, and it's, says white worker, big times, and then beware. There's, some racist cartoon, beware, we want your jobs, we want your homes, we want your country, wake up. So fanning those flames. So this period is really about the Nazification of the Klan. So after the civil rights victories, the Klan is increasingly beginning to see the US government as an enemy, not as a friend. And we've also moved far enough away from World War II, where it was patriotic to be fighting Nazis. We've moved far enough away from that time period. So now there's not as much problems with getting involved with Nazis, right? So there's this increased collaboration between traditional patriotic, quote unquote, racist organizations and neo-Nazi groups advocating armed revolution against the US government under the umbrella, quote unquote, the United Racist Front. And so there's this new drive to build organizations and recruit new members. So 1974 to 1981, the Klan begins recruiting on college campuses, memberships growing and grew from about 1,500 to over 10,000. So I want to I want to talk about an example of this sort of organizing. So when the punk and metal scenes were first coming to prominence in the 1970s, they really encapsulated the feelings of working class people, mostly white, who were betrayed by conditions out of their control. So a group of National Front members agreed on intervening in these subcultural milieus to turn them into these breeding grounds for fascism and to begin actively working to recruit fascist skinheads and punks and disaffected suburban youth as quote unquote political soldiers. This approach, one reason I'm talking about is this approach would later form the bedrock of the alt-rights ideology and their strategy as well. On the West Coast, some members of the punk subculture began to use Nazi symbolism for shock effect at first, but some others were adopting neo-Nazism in earnest. And in 1981, the Dead Kennedys wrote the song Nazi Punks Fuck Off as a response to white power skinheads attending their shows. So many punk subcultures were very successful in organizing, in identifying Nazis and neo-Nazis who were coming to the shows and intervening to chase out the neo-Nazis who then had to go back into the woods, back into hiding, had to go form their own scene somewhere else. And there still is a very fringe subculture of white power, punk, and metal music to this day, but they are routinely identified and marginalized by other punk and metal subcultures. So in 1980, Reagan gets elected. These white nationalist groups are emboldened. And what we see is First Amendment battles become popular as neo-Nazi groups organize demonstrations at public facilities, at schools, and at libraries. We also see a rise in some violence. Between 1979 and 1980, 24 Black people and 2 white women in interracial relationships were murdered by white supremacists in 7 different cities. 1979 to 1981, 24 Black children, adolescents, and adults were mysteriously murdered in Atlanta. So there's violence happening. And then I want to share a quote from someone who was involved in the white power punk scene and then later got out. And his quote was, "We recognized in the mid-'80s that our edginess, our look, even our language was turning away the average American white racist, people we wanted to recruit. So we decided then to grow our hair out, to stop getting tattoos that would identify us, to trade in our boots for suits, and to go to college campuses and recruit there and enroll, to get jobs in law enforcement, to go to the military and get training, and to even run for office." So this is also pointing to the fact that the only connecting value within the white supremacy movement is this consolidation of white hegemonic power. They will give up whatever uniform they're using, whatever words they're using, whatever, whatever strategy they're using if it stops being useful, and take on whatever else they can do just so that they can consolidate this white hegemonic power. Next slide, please. So this is an image of the Oklahoma City bombing, and over it is a flyer for an event put on by white nationalist, quote unquote, thought leader, called, quote, "Diversity, is it good for America," unquote. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the 1990s right now. So in 1990, American Renaissance magazine launches. It promotes scientific, quote, race realism, unquote, focused on the alleged links between race and intelligence and on eugenics. So here comes eugenics again. And this magazine leads to these conferences, to these think tanks, to this fake pseudoscience around race. Also during this time, the term lone wolf was popularized by white supremacist leaders in the 1990s. So the leaders were advocating individual or small cell underground activity as opposed to above ground membership organizations, envisaging quote unquote leaderless resistance, or quote warriors acting alone or in small groups who attack the government or other targets in daily anonymous acts, unquote. But it's important to understand that lone wolf attacks are not isolated. They're an articulated piece of the white nationalist movement's strategy. In 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing kills hundreds, including many children, in retaliation for state repression of white nationalist paramilitary groups. So this is in retaliation for state involvement and repression of these white nationalist paramilitary groups. And so it leads to this shift in US policy in regards to white nationalist extremists, and US policy becomes more hands-off. They don't want to bother with these folks. They're scared of them, essentially. Next slide, please. So this is on the left-hand side, you see a screenshot of a Breitbart headline attacking Obama's IQ score. And on the right side, you see a picture from a Tea Party protest where a white man is holding a sign that says, quote, "Obama's plan, white slavery." So 2000s, online recruitment becomes a big thing. Stormfront membership grows from 5,000 to over 50,000 between 2002 and 2005. And 2,000 new members joined the day after Obama was elected. So that's 2008. This is the backlash to Obama. Again, remember what we talked about before. Every time Black people gain power or more self-determination, or even in the appearance of that, there's this backlash. So the Tea Party came out during this time, right? And what we saw is suddenly like shouting crowds, bringing guns to like town halls, and their focus was fighting any of Obama's initiatives, anything that that administration was trying to do. Breitbart is launched. InfoWars also takes off during this period, so we're starting to see these conspiracy theories, these disinformation campaigns. There were these attacks on left institutions by folks like Project Veritas, right? They targeted Acorn, which was an organizing, a community organizing group, Planned Parenthood, and they attacked them with these coordinated disinformation campaigns to try and delegitimize them. Now I'm going to pass it back to Katie.
Go ahead, Nicole. Gonna pass it off to Nicole.
Hey, y'all. I'm Nicole. I organize with CRCAA. I'm a white woman with long blonde hair, and I'm sitting in my kitchen. I'm really glad to be here with y'all today. So this kind of brings us up to the present. This is an image from that Hail Trump moment when Richard Spencer gave this speech and folks started throwing out Nazi salutes after Trump got elected. So we're not going to go like blow for blow all the things that have happened in the last 4 years because you've been living it, so you're probably familiar. But we are going to kind of give an overview of the map of the modern day white nationalist movement and some of the players. And we're going to kind of isolate and articulate the primary strategies and tactics and messaging that this movement is using currently. So here on the slide, this is a map of the modern day white nationalist movement. And it's kind of a beast. I'm going to try to use my cursor to show you what I'm pointing at. The really important thing to understand is that, as we like to say, a fascist is ugly, but a fascist coalition is dangerous. Okay, and so when different strands of white nationalism and strands of fascists start clicking up and actually finding ways to work together, that's a problem. So we have to understand like what these different strands are, what their interests are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and what their divisions are, so we can drive wedges and split, you know, blow this coalition up basically, because coalitions are dangerous. So first, I want to bring your attention to the rich white nationalists with a long-term strategy. This is really important. I think often the way that like the white supremacist movement is depicted is it's always kind of scapegoated poor and working class white people. And frankly, like that's bullshit. It's always been like white owning class, ruling class people who've had the most interest in maintaining white nationalism and trying to make white nationalism popular. So that's what these guys do. These guys that have money from slavery all the way back to that, they're using that money to create think tanks and magazines and conferences. So as groups like the American Renaissance and like the American Freedom Foundation that started funding people like Milo Yiannopoulos and Lauren Southern to do speaking engagements on colleges around the country, right? So they started working together. This was kind of like, you guys remember the free speech rally era where these folks with money started funding kind of young people who were looking to have like political careers by being edgy and white supremacists to go speak on college campuses. And this is going back to the tactic that the Klan used in the 80s about like, if this is a publicly funded institution, people have First Amendment rights, they should be allowed to speak at these places. And if it were really only about speech, that would be one conversation. But the really dangerous thing about these free speech rallies is that all these other folks were coming out of the woodwork to stand together and to see each other in real life, right? So the neo-Nazi parties and gangs that used to have their rallies out in the woods, like this picture shows, they were coming out. These free speech rallies were kind of giving them a platform to come out and demonstrate in public. And they were meeting up with all the young, alienated white men that they have been working to radicalize on the internet. So people who've been on Daily Stormer every day for the last 10 years, but have never really come out about being fascists, suddenly they could go to UC Berkeley and see their favorite celebrity talking about white nationalist politics. And so these groups all coming together and forming, this was something that we had to pay attention to. It's important to understand where kind of the violent threats are. Oh, sorry, my cat just bit me because I haven't fed her yet. These folks on the internet, there's a really, really like deep alienation and lack of like power, and also a lack of like meaningful connection. That's really dangerous. Human beings are designed to connect with each other and to be in like meaningful community. And so we have a generation of people that are growing up and hanging out in their room on their laptop all day. That's a recipe for violence and danger. And we've seen that with folks like Dylan Roof and Elliot Rodger. It's important to understand in this era how much the white nationalist movement is using misogyny as a recruitment tool. So really like articulating the piece of white nationalism that is about misogyny and about women being kind of property for white men, really stirring that up and getting these folks to come out and join this movement. Then we have kind of like the patriot militia groups. These are folks who tend to be less on the Nazi side of things. They are often like ex-military, so they have like a sense of being American, being part of the American military that fought the Nazis. They'll often disavow any connection with the Nazi movement, but they are very racist, right? And they've been socialized in our society and through the military to not see Black and brown people as human beings, which has enabled them to do a ton of violence to those folks all around the world. And they have military training that's very dangerous. And so these folks coming out and starting to click up with like the like angry white fascist boys from the internet, that's actually kind of starting to get more dangerous, right? Then we have, it's important to understand that there is a fascist sector in Silicon Valley. For those of you in the Bay Area, it's important to understand that this is, we think of this place as being very progressive, but that's really not the case. And there is a whole tendency amongst the kind of Silicon Valley tech crowd, including this guy, Peter Thiel, who's the founder of PayPal, amongst other tech companies, who believe in something called neo-reaction. This basically just means that they think that white men are biologically superior to all other creatures and should rule everything, that democracy is a fallacy and all this kind of stuff. So they're coming out, they're supporting people like Trump and Proud Boys and Milo Yiannopoulos and Lauren Southern are making great use of technology and tech platforms like Twitter to kind of like spread their shit, and the Silicon Valley fascists are enabling them to do that. It's important to understand that cops are absolutely part of the modern day white nationalist movement. This image here is from San Francisco just on May Day of this year. And this is a bunch of cops wearing Blue Lives Matter masks. Definitely associated with white nationalism, definitely clicked up. And what we saw is when these free speech rallies were happening and neo-Nazis and armed like militias were out in the streets of Berkeley, the police were protecting them. They were coordinating with them, and they were actively working with them to repress the anti-fascist movement and the big anti-fascist coalition that was coming together to oppose all of these forces. So now we're gonna get into some of the primary strategies that this horrible group of people is employing. I'll pass it to Jay.
Hey, so I want to talk about this big mouthful of a word, crypto-fascism, which sounds like a mouthful, but I promise you, once I start describing it, that you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. So this image is of Pepe the Frog, a meme that has been used by the alt-right, using the OK symbol, which is actually the white power symbol. You can do this with your own hand, that the 3 fingers make a W, and then it makes a P if you flip it the other way around. So crypto-fascism is when you're a fascist, or at least an admirer or sympathizer of fascism, but you know that in this climate, that revealing the truth about yourself would be social and political suicide. So you disavow fascism, but still hang out with fascists and do fascist shit. So a major tactic is to hide your fascism behind jokes, and memes, and then gaslight anybody who calls you on it. So the OK hand sign being a code for white power is a perfect example of this. Like if somebody texted me something offensive and then used the OK sign, I would be like, dude, you know that's a sign for white power, right? And like, that's not okay. And then they'd be like, no, you're being too sensitive, haha, it's just a joke. And like, that's crypto-fascism. And I wanna read a quote that was from a post on Reddit by an anonymous user after Charlottesville entitled, "Fixing the Alt-Right," which I think really exemplifies crypto-fascism. The quote is, quote, "Don't get trapped in an echo chamber where you can no longer relate to normies. Pretending that Charlottesville didn't massively push the average white person away is really stupid. We have a chance to actually make changes now that Trump has shifted the Overton window to the right, but we need to be smart and make the movement appealing to the average white person. Disavow all Nazi, KKK, edgelord LARPers. There's no way to lose public support quicker than by going around making Nazi salutes and holding tiki torches while chanting, 'Jews will not replace us.' This instantly makes the average person hate you. Build a populist movement with realistic, incremental, overt goals. Repealing the 1965 Immigration Act and replacing it with something that both limits total immigration and prioritizes white immigration is an actual, tangible political goal. Keep the long-term goals covert. Talking openly about a white ethno-state only leads to failure and the average public turning against you. So disavow anyone revealing his power level. Leftists will recognize dog whistles and know we're crypto, but normies won't listen to them." I just want to read that last sentence again. Like, leftists will recognize dog whistles and know we're crypto, but normies won't listen to them. And that is like all of the population who isn't getting the joke or the meme is just going to be like, no, that's totally fine. That's like innocent stuff. But like, it's important for us to call that out and to not fall into crypto-fascism's bullshit. And after Charlottesville, a lot of the openly neo-Nazi groups rebranded themselves as American Patriots. Europa, which organized the Charlottesville protest, became American Identity Movement. Vanguard America became Patriot Front. Like, not scary names, but they're still doing scary shit with other fascists. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kelsey.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, so next slide, please. All right, we are, so another strategy of white nationalists, along with crypto-fascism, is the use of memes and the co-optation of anti-racist rhetoric to claim victimhood, even when they violently victimize others. So we're looking at a slide of a white nationalist meme. And there's a white woman smiling and a small white child with arms around her neck. The title of the meme says, "Anti-racist is code for anti-white." And the other language on the slide says, "White supremacist is just an anti-white slur." And the mass media are nothing but a knockout gang in coats and ties. Oh, the anti-white mass media, sorry folks. "We are denied homelands. Anyone who exposes that fact is called a white supremacist, but how could one be a supremacist if there were only white people around him? Are they against hate, or are they just anti-white?" Anyway, the acronym DARVO is over the faces of these two people on the meme. So DARVO stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. The term was coined originally in reference to how domestic abusers might tend to act when they are called out for being abusive. An example is like, "I'm not abusive, she's the one who hit me." And this is what white nationalists do. White nationalists claim victimhood. And this meme is reflective of this pattern of backlash that we've been talking about. They're losing ground. They're speaking to the vulnerability of the imminent loss of white power in order to recruit white folks to the white nationalist cause. So here's a good example of DARVO in action from Trump's executive order that he made last week, banning diversity trainings as quote unquote divisive. The executive order calls out government vendors who teach critical race theory, white privilege, and unconscious bias. It states that such training that, quote, promotes race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating similarly undermines efficiency in federal contracting. This order threatens to ban contracts towards any anti-bias, anti-oppression, cultural competency training within the federal government and who they contract with, calling it the actual racism. As per usual, Trump posted a tweet. He tweeted about the executive order, and it reads, "A few weeks ago, I banned efforts to indoctrinate government employees with divisive and harmful sex and race-based ideologies. Today, I've expanded that ban to people and the companies that do business with our country, the United States military, government contractors, and grantees. Americans should be taught to take pride in our great country. And if you don't, there's nothing in it for you." So some of these divisive concepts that Trump was naming in this order are the idea that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist, the idea that an individual, by virtue of his race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously, and the idea that an individual, by virtue of his race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. So Trump is the primary predator here. Yet the support for this order, the implementation of it, and the public support of all of this rhetoric is what is being enacted by secondary predators. So I just want to continue with that distinction. And again, this meme, this most recent executive orders, their claims of victimhood, of anti-racist struggle and cultural competency training as the oppression. And also, they are an indicator that we are doing the right work. We're gaining ground. What white nationalists are doing is scary, and it's also defeatable. The most important thing to understand is that our solidarity has always been these folks. And they are a small minority of people. Even white folks struggling with white supremacy don't always prescribe to this ideology. So we got to keep going. But back to Nicole with more tactics.
Hey, so another tactic that the modern day white nationalist movement is using a lot is internet rabbit holes. I'm curious if people have been hearing about QAnon. Yeah, maybe. I can't see the chat because I'm sharing my screen. But the picture on the slide here is a man at a Trump demonstration wearing a shirt that has the QAnon slogan, "When we go one, we go all," and holding a sign that says "Save the children." So QAnon, basically, like, very long story short, is a conspiracy theory. It's basically like a remix of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If people are familiar with that, that was an anti-Semitic pamphlet that was distributed a lot here in the United States during that second wave of the Klan. And it basically put forward this idea that, like, Jewish people secretly control the world. They're in this, like, satanic cabal, and they drink the blood of children, and that's how they got so powerful. And so QAnon is just like a remix on that. It's like, oh, there's a secret cabal that's really controlling the whole world, and they're drinking the blood of children, and it's a pedophile, like, child sex trafficking ring, right? So it's like the most inflammatory, it's like the worst thing that somebody could think of. And the theory of QAnon is that Trump is the hero that's here to, like, save our country from these evil satanic pedophiles. Which is odd because Trump has, like, a long history of people accusing him of child sex abuse. Conspiracy theories are really effective when they validate people's real anxieties and then blame an outsider. Like, pick a target that people kind of don't feel too much cognitive dissonance about blaming and scapegoating for that anxiety. I think that, like, the anxiety that people who are, like, elites who have a lot of power can abuse that power in horrific ways that really hurt the most vulnerable people is, like, completely true. Like, that's a real phenomenon. We saw that with like the Catholic Church, for example, right? It's like when people have power and it's unchecked, a lot, abuse happens. That is a real thing. But the idea that like Trump is going to save the country from that by locking up all the Democrats is like not really addressing the complexity of the systems and structures that lead to that kind of abuse of power, right? So it's a false solution. And like really the thing I want to say to everyone about QAnon is that you need to call your mom. Like, it's really good for fascists when we're like isolated and alienated and we're not talking to each other and we're on the internet by ourselves. Like that is just like the perfect recipe for like getting sucked in to fascist ideology. And so like now more than ever, especially in this pandemic moment, like QAnon really took off during the pandemic when people were trapped inside and isolated. It is so important that we are talking to our people, like really talking to our people. Part of my role in CRCA for a long time has been like monitoring the alt-right and monitoring these kind of white nationalist groups and looking at their propaganda, seeing what kind of messages they're using. And like, so my internet algorithm is fucked. Like I see like the craziest shit gets like recommended to me on YouTube and like recommended to me on like the ads. Like it's really pretty nutty. And like, it's so important that I'm part of this organization of other white people that I can talk to and that I'm not getting like sucked into that shit. Because I'm not alone. And when we're connected to our communities, we're a lot harder to kind of organize in the way that QAnon's organizing at the moment. I'm gonna pass it to Katie.
Right on, thanks, Nicole. So just a real quick reminder to folks who are joining us on this webinar on Zoom, to please definitely use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen if you have any questions, and we will do our best to get to them at the end of this presentation. And if you're watching this on Facebook, definitely post any questions that you have on the comments or send us a message and we will do our best to respond to those as well. So electoralism, we're looking at a really horrific photo of Trump getting inaugurated. What we want to talk about here in terms of this strategy, right? None of this is going to really be surprising to y'all, I'm sure. But the electoral arena, they're organizing there. White nationalists are organizing very strongly in the electoral arena and have since the founding of this country, since they came over and colonized, right? So hardcore far right-wing white nationalists, hardcore far right-wing white nationalists believe that the state is controlled by their mortal enemies, right? Kind of like what Nicole was saying with QAnon. They consider their mortal enemies to be a cabal of satanic child molesters, or quote, the Zionist occupied government, or ZOG, or whatever their particular flavor is. But they are using the electoral arena to pursue and seize governing power. Trump, obviously, but at every level of government, all the way down to the local levels. They also have advanced a strategy of taking over the Republican Party and using it for their purposes. They have not formed coalitions with more moderate, what they call, quote, cuck-servatives, and they've taken over the party apparatus, and it only took them like 3 presidential election cycles to do this. So they didn't compromise on their far right-wing positions, and they've been successful in achieving this level of power. And the left could do well, definitely, to learn from this, right? We want to learn from our enemies. We also recognize that our enemies have the status quo on their side, and we don't. So that's an important distinction as well. Obtaining governing power like this gives the white nationalist movement the means to employ policies that advance their agendas, right? Policies like building the wall, mass deportations, forced sterilizations, banning anti-racist education in public schools, etc. And one thing that's really important about all these policies that we're naming, right? Building the wall, mass deportations, forced sterilizations, like none of those things are new, right? They're not new under Trump. they're exacerbated and they're heightened and they're worse, right? This is an outright white nationalist agenda. But again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning of this presentation and primary predators, that the United States is a white nationalist project. So inherently the policies coming from the federal government are going to be promoting white nationalism. That's at the fabric of this country. And Community Ready Corps believes that reform is not possible. It cannot be reformed. Rather, they refer to the electoral arena, or what people call reform, they refer to it as relief. They do believe in the value of organizing this arena, but it achieves relief while building for ultimate resolution, or what other folks call revolution. We talk about this arena and this area where the white nationalists are organizing because we can't afford to cede any terrain to white nationalists. We have to fight them on every front, right? The electoral arena is an important front, and not the only front or even the most important front, but it is a front that we should fight on. We should organize electorally to keep white nationalists from gaining governing power. Absolutely. Also, again, reminder that Democrats also advance white nationalist policies. It's in the fabric of this country. It's what the system was designed to do. And I'm going to pass it over to Margaret.
So you can see here a picture of white men dressed in Hawaiian shirts holding military grade weapons. We're going to talk about accelerationism. So accelerationism is the idea that that things will have to get worse before they get quote unquote better. That a white nationalist utopia is just on the other side of the race war. So we're going to talk about boogaloo, right? Boogaloo is this made up term that basically means race war, quote unquote. It comes from Civil War II, Electric Boogaloo, right? So Boogaloo is also very connected to crypto-fascism that we were talking about before as well. Boogaloo boys are people who want to help bring about a second American Civil War for the purpose of reestablishing American fascism and white nationalism. This idea has been propagated online through memes and quote unquote jokes, but constitutes the scripted violence we talked about regarding lone wolf attacks. So folks may have heard about Stephen Carrillo. He's an active duty member of an elite Air Force unit. He used the George Floyd rebellion as political cover to attack law enforcement. He murdered a Federal Protective Service officer in Oakland on May 29th, while a Black Lives Matter demonstration was happening several blocks away. Boogaloo patches, images, and slogans were found inside the van that was used to commit this murder when Carrillo was later arrested. This was an accelerationist tactic. It was designed to turn the public against the movement to defend Black lives and to create the justification for the criminalization of that movement. News pundits claimed that this officer was quote unquote murdered by rioters, and Trump repeated this claim in a speech on June 1st saying, quote, a federal officer in California, an African-American enforcement hero, was shot and killed. These are not acts of peaceful protest. These are acts of domestic terror, unquote. It's also wild that Oakland PD was seen wearing the Boogaloo uniform of a Hawaiian shirt while serving a search warrant on a Black family in West Oakland recently. So folks who are involved with this, they don't even care that one of their own was murdered. It's just collateral damage for their race war strategy. I'm gonna turn it back to Katie.
Thanks, Margaret. So here, another strategy is violence, right? Another strategy of the white nationalist movement is violence. And we're looking at a photo of some white nationalist militia members all in a row with lots of firearms, bulletproof vests, and one of them has an American flag. So Why are we talking about violence? Because it's very prevalent, and it's it's a strategy that the white nationalist movement has been using since white nationalists colonized this country, right? So violence that we see today with the white nationalist movement is that there are militias. They're organizing militias. There's a whole network called My Militia Network, and their goal is to have a white nationalist militia for every area code in the country. White nationalists are also stockpiling weapons. Oregon is currently, or at least as of last week, was completely sold out of bullets, the entire state of Oregon. White nationalists also stage armed occupations. Think of the Bundys in Oregon in 2015, right? And they also enact mass shootings, right? Margaret talked to us earlier in the 90s about how the idea of a lone wolf was popularized by white supremacist leaders in the 1990s. And a lot of folks, you know, the dialogue around these mass shootings is this kind of lone wolf idea. And what we want to make very clear is that lone wolf attacks, these mass shootings, are not isolated. They're an articulated piece of the white nationalist movement's strategy. And on that note, want to share with y'all a bit. Many of us in this webinar, I'm sure, have been touched either directly or indirectly, are not that many degrees removed from mass shootings. I know myself, I was at Gilroy Garlic Festival at the mass shooting back in July of 2019. And one thing that became very apparent to me after that experience is that, well, I guess two things. One is that the violence that's being enacted by the white nationalist movement is not just violence for the sake of violence, it's violence to terrorize, right? All this violence is terrorism, and that's their goal, right? They want to make folks feel like if I go to the grocery store, I could get killed, right? Anyone could just shoot up anywhere, right? That's what they want. But it's really important. And I was able to, that day, being there on scene at Gilroy when the mass shooting was happening, the training that I had by Community Ready Corps kicked in, just, you know, unconsciously. I couldn't even tell you why I was doing what I was doing in the moment. You know what I mean? And so it's really important that we all get trained to the best of our ability and understand the skills that we already have. We've all survived in various ways. We've lived this long. We have skills, and we just need to hone in on them and how to use them. And so we really believe in self-defense. Community Ready Corps teaches us about self-defense, right? And really believes in that. And we can get trained, and we need to get trained up because, right, the police are promoting the white nationalist movement, right? We have to get rid of the police. We need to be coordinated. CRC talks about how there's nothing stronger than a well-trained, competent, coordinated mass. And that is so true. And so if any of y'all want to find out more about how to get trained up in this way, self-defense training by CRC or CRCA, contact us, and I'll put our email in the chat, crcaa.info@gmail.com. But again, like, these folks are violent. They're trying to terrorize us, and we got to defend ourselves, and we can get trained up to do that. I'll pass it over to Jay.
So speaking of a well-trained, coordinated mass, this image is a photo from a mass community protest when Milo Yiannopoulos tried to speak at UC Berkeley in 2017. And now that you understand that the white nationalist movement is absolutely defeatable, and history shows us it's been defeated over and over and over again, let's talk about how we do it now. And we as white people have a responsibility to proactively address white nationalist organizing that's happening in our communities. And some of us, a lot of us on this webinar, are targeted by white nationalism, but we still have white privilege to weaponize in this fight against white nationalists. Our prime objective is to prevent and intervene against white nationalist violence in all its forms, and to undermine white nationalists' ability to recruit and undermine white support for white supremacy more broadly. And before we go into the 5 methods and how we're going to accomplish that prime objective, it's really important to state that anti-racist militancy requires revolutionary discipline. I'm going to say it again for the people in the back. Anti-racist militancy requires revolutionary discipline. History shows that the state will always attempt to characterize anti-racist community defense as violent. We have a responsibility as white people practicing intervention to do our part to minimize the state's ability to criminalize and repress our comrades by practicing revolutionary discipline in both action and speech. Practicing revolutionary discipline also means doing things that we do not want to do, doing things that are no fun at all, like learning and sitting and breathing through this webinar about the horrible history of white nationalism. But I want to move us into the 5 methods and what we can do to defeat white nationalism. And I'll pass it to Margaret.
Thanks, Jay. So the first method we're going to talk about is education. Particularly in this case, we're getting to know your Nazi. So this image just is a photo of Patriot Front demonstrating in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. It's really nice of them to dress up in uniforms, so they're easy to recognize. They like their blue windbreakers, their khaki hats, khaki pants, white face masks. Lots of these groups have particular uniforms. We talked about Boogaloo. So knowing your Nazi, knowing the crypto-fascist memes and jokes, all those sort of things, learning from our enemy's tactics, right? What works? Are there any of them that are reproducible on our side? Again, recruitment is a key strategy that they use, and something that we can get so much better at. And we're going to talk more about that when Kelsey talks about organization. But yeah, like what can we use? We just did education, right? You just sat through this webinar. So share what you learned with your people. In particular, white people, we have the responsibility to take the teacher role with other white people, to take that burden off of people of color. And keep learning, right? Especially nothing can replace observation and participation in real life struggles against oppression. And you know, it's so important that we're doing this work with the folks in our community. And with that, Kelsey's going to talk more about organization.
Thanks, Margaret. And I just wanted to kind of like repeat that the 5 methods of divesting of white power and weaponizing white privilege were developed by Community Ready Corps. And so we as white folks definitely have to teach our other white people, and we're drawing our learning from the brilliance and genius that is Community Ready Corps, and we are disseminating that to you all. And so I'm going to now talk about organization. Yeah, so raise your hand if after listening to 2 hours about white nationalists, you're feeling like the last thing you want to do is organize other white people. Just me? Cool. We're on a webinar. I can't see anybody. Anyways, moving on from that joke. So we're looking at a slide naming the method of organization. It's about bringing white folks into anti-racist struggle, and especially bringing in white folks who are at risk of aligning with white nationalist ideology. It's about counter-recruitment. So the 3 images on this slide are of groups that we need to strategically organize: white women, white evangelicals, and the isolated young white men in our lives. The Southern Poverty Law Center put out a report that showed that 6% of the 198 million people living in the US have beliefs consistent with the racist right, also white, worldview, believing that politics should promote white interests above interests of other groups. So that's only 6%. And you know, we're willing to bet that more than 6% of people living in the US have beliefs consistent with anti-racism. We just might be maybe a little less committed or active or organized than the right is. And it's up to us to change that. So, you know, Margaret mentioned in earlier slides how like white nationalist groups have changed their aesthetics. We've learned how they've changed their tactics, and they've done all these things to recruit more effectively. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to adapt or change in order to be more effective in our recruitment into anti-racist struggle? We specifically got to talk about the young, angry, alienated white men in our lives, the Dylan Roofs of the world. Who are they in our lives? Do you know someone who fits this category? What about the other two? If we're not willing to engage and organize someone like them, what do we expect to happen? Every white person we don't organize is a white person we are offering up to white nationalists. And you can't organize the people you don't love. So start in your network. Start with who you know. If somebody invited you to this webinar, or you invited somebody to this webinar, make time or space to talk about what you learned and what you can do about it. Relationships are power. And last thought, we need to organize to win governing power. We got to organize our own to vote Trump out. And I'll pass it off to Jay.
So the next method is contribution, not control. And this is a picture from a big, huge, beautiful anti-Trump protest that took place in Oakland right after Trump got elected. And this photo was actually taken from the sound truck where CRC was leading this march. And we believe, and I think it's a pretty safe belief, that the way to beat fascism is through coalition politics. Fascists want to eliminate or at least subjugate all Black people, all people of color, all immigrants, disabled folks, Muslims, Jews, queers, women, addicts, and poor people. You get the point, and I'm probably leaving some out here. Our tactical advantage is there are so many more of us than there are of them. And we have to play to that tactical advantage by forming broad coalitions led by the most targeted folks. And we can tell you from experience that white people are usually the one who make this shit impossible with our controlling, internalized white supremacy ways. So we gotta address that shit in ourselves and with each other, contributing, not controlling, and cut it out so we can actually win. A principle of contribution, not control is all about regulating our nervous system. So if white people are in a coalition to defeat white nationalism and we can't regulate our nervous system and are bugging out, we are gonna be way less effective and potentially dangerous. And the alt-right is some no joke scary shit. So we have to practice regulating our nervous system on a much smaller scale. Find a way to regulate your nervous system, whether that is deep breathing or mindful movement or repeating a mantra. It sounds basic, but I'm gonna really encourage you to find a practice that works for you because it's vital. And I'll pass it on to Nicole.
Okay, so the next method is intervention. And as we've kind of said, you know, there's always been opposition to white supremacists and white nationalists in this country. At every step of the way, there's always been opposition, and that opposition has been expressed in a lot of different ways. So like on this slide, we see flyers and a newspaper from the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, from the organizing they were doing in the 80s and 90s. A lot of different tactics have been used by a lot of different people over the years. And our politics at CRCA is not to tell people what tactics to use or what tactics not to use. Like, we don't consider that our business. We believe that white supremacy exists everywhere and that all of us have the ability to fight it from where we are and from the skills and relationships and resources that we have. So we believe that we need to fight on all fronts, like on every single front. If you're like, but Nicole, should we fight on this front? I'm just gonna be like, yes, fight on that front, fight on every single front. And we need to have a mass movement, which means that we're gonna be multi-tendency. So we're gonna have some people who feel called and led to make our communities spaces that are very unfriendly to white nationalists. There's people who feel called and led to punch Nazis in the mouth on site, right? And that's great. Like, we need that. Do that. Do it. It's wonderful. If that's not you, you know, maybe you have another tendency. Maybe your tendency is you're going to organize your community to vote Trump out of office in November. That is also intervention. We need people on every front and in every tendency getting in where we fit in and finding ways to intervene. There's a couple things that we do want to kind of put forward, though, for this historical moment, and kind of our observations of shifts that we as white folks in this movement need to think about in order to kind of advance towards like a full defeat of this movement. So first thing I want to say is we need to get over our discomfort with guns and weapons. Just like period, point blank. There's a huge like culture on the right of being super into guns, and there's a huge culture like among leftists and liberals of like being anti-gun. And that's always kind of been like, that's been a wedge issue between like Democrats and Republicans for a long time. We're just noticing that the right, and particularly our enemies in the white nationalist movement, there's a huge gap between the like facility and access that they have with firearms and like those of us in the rest of the community. If we don't know how to operate firearms safely, even if the only thing we would ever want to do with a firearm is take the bullets out of it, we should know how to do that. Like, that's a basic core competency. And so that's one intervention we want to put forward right now, is that we got to kind of get over this, like, we'd rather feel safe than be safe, like guns are freaky thing. We got to kind of get over that. It's time. Another thing we want to put forward is that the abolitionist movement, which has a long, long history in this country, obviously from the abolition of chattel slavery up to now, being led by Black folks, it is so important that we as white people get on board with abolition. And what I mean by that is a few things. One is we have to develop the political clarity that the state will not protect us or anybody else from fascists, like from the Klan, from neo-Nazi parties. Like, we can't count on the state to do that because the state's interests are actually bound up with the same interests of those groups. So if we're hoping that the state is going to be the thing that stops these groups from attacking our communities, we're going to be disappointed. We also, in the white community, like, really need to develop a more realistic understanding of harm and how harm happens. We've been thinking about this a lot with regards to like the QAnon phenomenon, right? Like, child sexual abuse is a real thing that happens in our communities. And it's something that a lot of us carry like a lot of trauma around. And when we don't, like, when we're not willing to actually address that real violence and harm that's happening in our communities, it's not a secret satanic cabal of people who are committing child abuse in our communities. It's our dads and our uncles and our sisters. It's people in our community. And so we need to really grapple with that and come up with some real solutions for our people that are hurting and don't want to be harmed and want to be safe, that don't rely on a white nationalist, military, violent state, and that don't rely on this kind of pattern that white folks in our communities have of like projecting our fear and pain onto Black bodies. Like, it's Black people that are criminals, it's immigrants that are criminals. We have to have a better understanding of how harm is really happening in our communities, and that it's not something that can be solved by locking somebody up. That doesn't actually do anything to stop harm from happening. And then the third kind of intervention we want to offer for folks to kind of take with you is the role of the whistleblower. So we're gonna share this video of our favorite recent whistleblower. This is Don Wooten, and I'll let the video speak for itself, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
You've had best foods in a sandwich, but what about a creamy chicken saute? Salad? Sure. But what about a pasta bake? Whatever's left in your fridge, you can do more with Best Foods than you think. See the possibilities at bestfoods.com.
I became a whistleblower. Now I'm a target. But I'll take a target any day to do what's right and just.
And I had several detained women on numerous occasions that would come to me and say, Miss Wooten, I had a hysterectomy. Why? I had no answers as to why they had those procedures. And one lady walked up to me and she said, what is he? Is he the uterus collector? Does he collect uteruses? And I asked her, what does she mean? And she says, everybody that I talked to has had a hysterectomy.
Things not being sanitized, coming to work, not having the proper PPE. I began to ask questions about why were the detainees not being tested, symptomatic or asymptomatic. And I was told that everybody wants COVID. Everybody knows the symptoms and the signs of COVID, so everybody wants COVID. I was told not to tell officers that there were detainees that they dealt with day in and day out that were positive. I single parent 5 children alone. ICDC was my reason and my means of employment.
I didn't accompany them on the procedures, and it's mind-blowing and it's mind-boggling. When you get in your vehicle after a 12-hour shift and you cry yourself home, and you're the only one in the vehicle asking why, what is going on, what is happening, I don't have an answer, why is nobody not hearing them or taking them, so to speak, seriously?
So I'm gonna stop there. There should be hella white women that are also working in these facilities standing with Don Wooten. And I think we believe that like white privilege can be weaponized against the white nationalist system. And we want to encourage each and every single one of you watching this to consider how you might be able to do that. A lot of times because we're categorized as white, we're seen as white, folks, we will have access to information that people assume we won't do anything about because we're white and because it's information about how an institution is harming people of color. And so we need to blow that up. And when we see stuff in the institutions that we're in, if you're in the healthcare system, if you're in the church, if you're in the prison system, like wherever you are, when you see something, you need to weaponize that knowledge and to bring it out. And we need to blow the whistle on these institutions. And with that, I'll pass it to Katie.
Thanks, Nicole. Just to double down on what Nicole was just talking about in terms of intervention, right? And to go back to what I was speaking on earlier in relationship to getting trained up and how CRC talks about that there's nothing stronger than a well-trained, coordinated, competent mass, right? A recent example is Kenosha, right? Kenosha, Wisconsin, with Kyle Rittenhouse walking through a protest and shooting people and killing people. That should not be able to happen. We got to get trained up. We got to get coordinated. We got to give a fuck enough about each other to actually work together. And not to say those folks didn't, right? But like folks did the best that they could to take him down at the time. And like we can always improve. We can always get better. So our last method that we want to talk about around how to defeat white nationalism, right? We talk about practicing the 5 methods, weaponize white privilege, and divest of white power. We're talking about divestment. And here we have a photo of Kellogg's cereals and then a building with a sign that says race betterment. So we know that the Black community has been starved for resources on purpose as a white nationalist tactic, right? Again, the United States is a white nationalist project, and the Black community has intentionally been starved for resources on purpose by this country and by white nationalism. We want to go back and do a little bit of history real briefly to kind of understand our context and why we're talking about divestment. And we want to particularly call out the role of philanthropy in the early eugenics movement. When we talk about divestment, we're not talking about philanthropy. Philanthropy is a strategy that capitalists use to increase their decision-making power, and divestment is a strategy that we use in CRCA and we encourage other white anti-racists to use to actually divest of that power. So the role of philanthropy in the early eugenics movement, John Kellogg, yep, like the cereal, funded the early eugenics movement, including the creation and distribution of, quote, scientific journals promoting eugenics within the medical establishment, quote, studies that created a database of, quote, undesirable families targeted for sterilization, and legislation that mandated doctors to sterilize, quote, undesirables. As a result of this legislation, funded again by John Kellogg, between 1907 to 1963, so over a 56-year period of time of the early 20th century, over 64,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized. A third of those sterilizations took place in the state of California. We need an anti-racist version of that, right? Anti-racist funding often goes to relief, which is important. But the right is funding think tanks, strategy, and infrastructure, and that's why they're winning right now. It's a big part of why. Example, the Race Betterment Foundation. One of the founders was John Kellogg. The right invests in infrastructure and strategy, as opposed to the left's traditional approach, contributing to charities, relief programs, the things that tug on heartstrings. The left is primarily about deconstruction of the status quo, fighting back against the structures that exist, and the left can be adverse to structures. We're calling for a shift from charitable contributions to strategic investment through divestment, strategic investment in work that supports organizing for self-determination. And as history and the current moment shows us, the Black struggle has been and is and will be on the forefront of defeating white nationalism. And yes, that takes resources. We still live under capitalism. And so we're actually going to make a call to all of y'all watching right now to divest to Community Ready Corps, which is on the forefront of the current Black struggle. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Nicole for getting to some Q&A. Got a little bit of time.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Hey, all right, so we got some questions and we've got about 15 minutes, so we're gonna try to address some of them. So first question was from Jenny, curious about how to continue working on targeting primary predators of the state when secondary predators of white nationalists are attempting to distract from those ongoing efforts to dismantle white supremacy. Is this where we as white people pivot to focus on targeting white nationalists and let Black and Indigenous people of color continue leading efforts to dismantle the state? This is a great question. And like, something that CRC says over and over and over again, that we do believe, but sometimes it can feel hard to believe, is that like the people actually have all the power. And like the state and the system, it has to be responsive to the people. Like it only operates through that consent. And so the reason why CRC is calling on white people specifically to organize around like the secondary white nationalist predators, like the kind of grassroots of it, is because that grassroots movement like creates a sense that there is like a people's demand for these white nationalists' policies and agendas. And so it is so important that everywhere that that like white people are standing up and calling for white supremacist policies and agendas, that there are white people saying like, those people don't speak for me and they don't speak for my community, and like that there's visible, audible opposition. Like that's why that's our role. And I actually think that if we do it right, it doesn't have to be a distraction from like the primary predatory system. Like just how those two are intertwined, like our struggles against both of them are also intertwined. Okay, then there's another question about how do you create conversations with friends and family when they start red pilling or getting further into alt-right rhetoric? I know we should be bringing and keeping people close, but what if they have no interest in actual fact and are just repeating alt-right propaganda? Yeah, that's a super real question. I'd be curious if you relate to that question and there's someone in your life that you feel like you don't know how to talk to them about this stuff, put something in the chat. Let us know if that resonates for you, if you're grappling with this question. So yeah, like a bunch, right? A lot of our family members. So I don't have like a magic answer for this, and I'm sorry for that, but I will share with you a little bit of like what we've learned from CRC and from our own experiences. One is that the first principle of intervention, as CRC teaches it, is that the best intervention is prevention. The best intervention is prevention. And it's very true, right? It's like, once people have been sucked into that internet rabbit hole and they've like internalized all of that logic and all those talking points, our job is a lot harder. It's a lot harder. And so we want to be as proactive as possible. So all the people out there who are raising kids, all the people out there who are teaching and working with youth, like, you're so important, like being hyper, like aware that these folks are on the internet, like gunning for our young people, and being as proactive as possible in like interrupting that logic as you start to see it come up. And I think another thing that can be helpful is it's so hard to say because I don't want to like make you feel like, oh, if you just said this, like it would work. It's really challenging. I'm a big fan of ContraPoints, who did a lot of work on YouTube at the like peak of the like white nationalism on YouTube thing, and I think that it's kind of instructive to watch some of their stuff. I think they did a good job of like people. There's a lot of stories of people who were like all in on alt-right stuff getting like unred pilled by watching some of those videos. And I think one of the tactics that they use that was really effective is like not being afraid to have the conversation. So not being like, I think deplatforming is a really good tactic, and we should do that, especially when it comes to like a big platform like speaking at UC Berkeley or something like that. But like, if I'm just talking to my cousin, like I don't need to deplatform my cousin. Like anything that my cousin could repeat that he read on an alt-right on Reddit is like not scary enough to me that I can't hear it and respond to the logic of it and like out logic it. Their logic isn't solid. And so I think being willing to have those conversations and to try to stay as calm and like compassionate as possible is helpful. I think that like when we escalate, that's kind of what the alt-right hopes that we'll do. And you'll see it if you watch their propaganda. It's like, oh, leftists have no sense of humor, you know, leftists think everyone they don't like is a Nazi, all that stuff. So like kind of coming down off those labels and really like listening and being compassionate is helpful. Also, another thing I always think about is Ruby Sales, who's a really important elder Black activist. She talks about, when talking to white people, asking like, where does it hurt? Like, where does it hurt? Like, I think people are drawn to that Black pill stuff from like a place of pain and alienation. And I think like when we are willing to kind of like wade into that and connect with that, we have a better shot at, helping walk folks out of that horrible jungle. And this is stuff that we should all keep talking about, you know, to find like what works. I see another question, question 3. We talked about the role of white women in the Klan during the second wave. And so the question is, how are we seeing white women showing up in the current wave of white supremacy? And how is that interacting with the explicit tool of misogyny in the current wave? Yes, really good question and really interesting phenomenon to observe. I would say that like the alt-right's culture of and reliance on misogyny to recruit might be its biggest weakness. It might be its biggest weakness. There were some white women who were like popular alt-right personalities, people like Lauren Southern or Brittany Pettibone, who I think her name's different now because she got married. But they really got chased out of the movement by the misogyny. Their own like bases of like these like racist white men who were into these women at first because they were like hot young women talking about white nationalist talking points. Those men still like turned on them and were like, you're not traditionalist enough. Like, why aren't you married? Why are you involved in politics? Like, that's not traditionalist femininity or whatever. And a lot of those women have like moved away and just like, or like moved away from the movement, or like other women like seeing that are like, that's not a movement I want to be part of. That's really like the far like hard alt-right though. Like I think we also have to really recognize that like 53% of white women in this country voted for Trump, right? So even though Trump is definitely a misogynist and like deploys misogyny in his like political rhetoric, for some reason there's still a lot of white women that are fans. And so we definitely gotta deal with that. And I think like the stuff from the second wave of the Klan is instructive. Like white women joined the Klan as like a civic group to fight for white women's right to vote. Like there's this suffrage era and like, should women be allowed to vote? Should people of color be allowed to vote? And so there was some like self-interest of like, we can get the vote. And we think our best shot at that is clicking up with white nationalists. And so, yeah, like what is the self-interest that white women are seeing in a Trump administration? And how do we either have a better answer for that self-interest, or how do we like organize and interrogate, like, why is that your self-interest? Like you should pick another interest. I don't know. Let's see, I'm gonna go to the Q&A. Cool. People want to learn more about self-defense. Yes, absolutely. Oh, I do want to say one thing about the thing I said about guns and firearms. What I am not saying is that we should all like stockpile firearms and weapons and like be out here like terrorizing people the way that the white nationalist movement does. Like that is absolutely 100% not what I'm saying. What I am saying is like knowledge is power, information is power. And we should go through like the legal established channels to get like trained and certified and have like responsible gun ownership and like understanding of how that stuff works. So I just want to clarify that. Plans to deal with white nationalist craziness. likely to erupt between November 3rd and January 21st. So one thing, and I'm not trying to call you out at all, Dorian, because this is a really good question, but something I have learned, like as someone trying to fight fascism in the last couple of years, is like that the word crazy is like coming from out of the eugenics movement. It's like, ooh, people that are neurodivergent are like bad. And so like crazy, like we say crazy when we mean bad or chaotic or whatever. And so I'm trying to stop using that word. And maybe you want to think about doing the same. There is like a lot of fear and kind of feeling about what's going to happen after the election. And I think important things to say, I don't want to like speak for the organization, except to say that like we will work to continue to defend the safety and survival and self-determination of people in our community. CRC will continue to do that in the Black community. We will continue to support that work. And so that does include making sure that it is safe for Black people to vote. That means that we do need to be organizing around the polls and making sure that people are able to do that safely and aren't being threatened with violence for trying to use that civil right of voting. I've seen some calls advocating that people pressure police and sheriff's department to make a commitment to not collaborate or to have any to work with militia groups around the elections. I think that's probably something that's more relevant in different regions than the Bay. But yeah, I think that we definitely all need to be getting prepared and thinking seriously about like what we are, what we're gonna need to do to try to defend against like another development in the white nationalist movement. Sorry,
Nicole, can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Awesome. So really appreciate that question, and also second Nicole and not using the word crazy in a derogatory way. Bananas is a good word to use alternatively. I'm a fan of using bananas instead. But one thing that we have been trained by CRC around also is staying consistent and being clear about long-term political objectives. And while the political climate right now is definitely unprecedented in a lot of ways with the pandemic, climate collapse, right, the current iteration of fascism, it's also a sign of privilege to be surprised and also freaked out. And so we are going to continue to organize around the 5 methods and like keep moving forward with that, because that's going to be relevant now, January 21st and beyond, because again, white supremacy is still the primary target. And that, I just lost my train of thought. Wow. Pandemic brain. Am I right? Pandemic brain is super real. Oh, yes. Again, learning from the right? Learning from white nationalists, right? Taking what works for us. We get to take what works for us from them, right? They are consistent. They have decades-long strategies that they employ and don't waver from, where the left gets caught up in crisis after crisis after crisis, and we should respond effectively, but we also should not lose our long-term goals. Right? We have to be able to think longer than January 21st. We have to be able to think further than that. And so while now is super important, we need to also keep chugging along with our anti-racist organizing.
And on that note, I'm also seeing some questions about how to stay in touch with CRCAA and how to get more training. So I want to say a couple things about that. One is, please do follow us on Facebook. And we're also on Instagram and Twitter, and maybe somebody who's not speaking could put those links in the chat, so you can keep up with us. I will say that we are a relatively small group of volunteers who are organizing together and have been trained up to try to do this work. and have been grappling with what it means to kind of like scale up pretty rapidly in this moment where our work is very, very urgent. And so we're still developing what that's going to look like, and we will keep you updated. So follow us on social media so you can be the first to know when there's an opportunity to get plugged into this organization in a more long-term way. And also want to reiterate what Katie said, which is that CRC and CRCA do offer trainings on self-defense, community defense, and all kinds of things, from like defense against state repression and surveillance to defense against these kind of like white nationalist groups. And so if you're interested in that, particularly if you're like organized, like if you've got an organization or a school or a faith community or like a big group that would benefit from that training, send us an email at crcaainfo@gmail.com, and we'll work with you to make that happen. Thank you all so much. 7:02, so we're gonna wrap up now. If you learned anything or took something away from this webinar, if you could please write that in the chat. We would really benefit from hearing your feedback. And if you don't want to put it in the chat, you can email it to us if you want to do it privately. But yeah, we're really, really interested in what you guys think. And thanks for being with us.
I saw big us, little them in the chat. I love that.
Yes.
More of us.
Yeah. Whoop, whoop. Thanks, y'all. Train up. Yes. Train, train, train. CRC says you fight like you train, you know? So we got to train so we can fight and actually win. Heck yeah. We appreciate the thank yous. We did work hard on this. We were nervous about what you were going to think. So we're very, very happy to know that it was useful to you. Please practice the 5 methods. They're easy to remember: education, organization, contribution, control, intervention, and divestment. 5 methods. Yeah.
Share this recording with your folks. Watch it with your folks. Organize, educate. Get them to practice all the 5 methods on our Facebook page, CRC Allies and Accomplices.
Watch
party. Yes, exactly.
Hell yeah. Appreciate all the boot camp people. The recording will be available on our Facebook page as soon as we close out the webinar.
It's available now.
It's right there. Yeah. Also, again, our previous webinars on this topic, which have almost all entirely different content than this one did. They really do build on each other, so hopefully this one made sense, but if you want to go deeper, go check out the last one. Yeah. Great to see you, Haley. Thank you. Megan learns something new every time. We love you, Megan. Thank you.